it had to be Tolkien, which is a very big, bold statement. What the heck does that mean? That was something that we did actually spend a lot of time trying to sort through.
Tolkien is able to very earnestly deal with a battle of good and evil and what it does to people's souls. There are fates worse than death in Tolkien. People choosing to let themselves go under the control of the shadow is true tragedy. There are such things as good deaths in Tolkien, where characters die fighting impossible battles, but the point wasn't to win, the point was to fight. And the fact that they fought meant they chose the good.
My personal response to Tolkien's work is one of poetry, and that makes it very different to any other world. There's a romanticism in how he writes, and it's always in reflection upon the landscape that things are in, the elements, nature. He describes the fire of Hawley in the eyes of the dwarves. He describes the light of stars in the elven eyes, and you keep coming back to his themes in his work regarding nature and how they're reflected in each elements of all the races and cultures in this world.
One of the most magical things about Middle-earth is how real it feels. Tolkien literally would work out the phase of the moon during the part of Frodo's journey that he was in the Third Age. It was worked out with a rigor, the rigor of a linguist and of a historian.
Especially when we're concerned with architecture or physical objects. What are the techniques involved? What is the level of technology we're talking about? What are the materials we're using? And when you have that, then you're in an extension of the natural world.
That's one of the reasons why you go there. It feels discovered, not invented.
You walk in and you immediately feel like a dwarf. You could shut your eyes, walk into Moria, and I'm sure you'd know exactly where you were. Tolkien has this incredible way of inviting us to use our imagination, to be inspired by, to hear, to see, to feel things that we may not have seen before.
Anytime anybody would happen to walk into a room, and if they were watching over somebody else's shoulder, they would have to know where they were in the story, that the form and visual language for each culture had to be distinct enough that you could recognize it immediately as to where you were in the storytelling.
I felt very strongly that you, as an audience member, should be able to have your eyes closed and know where you are at any given scene, based on the music alone. Every realm has a cultural sound, and that sound is built from a very specific musical language and instruments that are only used in that environment, for that culture. We've never been to Numenor before in a live-action, on-screen adaptation, and I wanted that realm to feel like it was something different, something new that we hadn't experienced before. I was borrowing on Hollywood tropes for Mesopotamia, Babylon, and ancient Egypt. I'm using frame drums and doumbeks and an Armenian woodwind instrument called a duduk, and a Turkish string instrument called the yaylı tambor. I'm using Middle Eastern harmonies. Whereas the Harfoot theme leans on nomadic instruments, these wooden sounds. It's simpler. It stays on its path more. That tells you something about those characters.
Wood smoke! The others must have started baking!
From where did you procure the table?
Why do you ask?
Every object created by a culture is an opportunity to deepen that cultural experience a little more. It doesn't matter whether it's a doorknob, a cup, or a cathedral. It's the same culture, and it needs to belong to that same world. You know, much of the dwarves, the notion of this massive architecture where things are carved and where the nature of the stone is understood and respected, and they're able to do incredible carved cities. The elves obviously are very much inspired by nature, so obviously Art Nouveau has always been a big influence, even from the earliest illustrations I've done. The Númenóreans are a case apart. It's tempting to think of ancient Rome, but you wouldn't want to transpose ancient Rome to Númenor, but you want to transpose this notion of empire.
It's ancient. It feels like the Roman architecture all around the Mediterranean. You want to evoke that Mediterranean sense. And we can relate to it. We know what it is. It doesn't make us have to think hard about what it is. We stayed away from all those things that are too on the nose. There's no Ionic, Doric, or Corinthian columns anywhere, right? Every column is a Númenorian column in one form or another.
Clear and clear.
There was one game we played with our movement director, Lara, where she'd hide something in a room and then the hobbits would go in and find it as hobbits, which obviously was lots of like scuttling around and kind of like little squirrels. And then the elves was kind of barely doing anything, preserving as much energy as they could. And then the dwarves was kind of like moving tables really fast out of the way.
You walk in and you immediately feel like a dwarf when you know you're playing a dwarf. And if you are not playing a dwarf, but you're within the Dwarven Kingdom, you absolutely know exactly where you are.
You see, a mountain's like a person. It's a long and ever-changing story made of countless small parts.
It is the first time that we present, create, and embrace the female dwarf in all her entirety.
But how you do this, do you just make them sort of manly looking and pretend they're female? Because that would be the natural default for dwarves. But we also wanted to maintain some of the femininity, I guess, but they are dwarves. So that's where the extra hair came in, because that's the dwarven way.
It wasn't about being sexy in a sexualized way at all. There's a love that comes from the dwarves' love of materiality and stone and water and precious metals and that. And stone didn't all have to be hard angles. Stone can be softened by water. And I felt Disa was like water, and we sewed lots of precious stones, not real precious stones. But also we didn't want to cover Sophia up. You know, she's got a wonderful physicality and shape.
From every stitch of clothing, through every color correction choice, through every line of dialogue and every accent. I mean, so there are half a dozen to a dozen different axes upon which you can know where you are every single moment of the show that you're watching. But every single frame has 100 different, not just artistic choices that went into it, but logistical choices.
We had an advantage of having all the really muddy, grimy, gritty locations, and that really helps ground everything and makes things feel real. And so when you put this fantastic production design, art direction, visual effects, stunt, special effects, all of those departments working at their best, and then the core of it is at this real place, you get this amazing mix of magical and real.
Because even though it's fantasy, I like grounded fantasy. I like real characters. That the magic in Middle-earth doesn't come from some strange light effects. It comes from something organic. It comes from the wind. It comes from the water. It comes from the fire. It comes from things that belong to the earth.
In the most part, a lot of it is actually in camera, because we figured out a way to make it look real enough that visual effects just has to do some enhancing. Doesn't necessarily, in most of the shots, have to add a whole lot into the frames.
For instance, in the village, when all of a sudden the water's busting out of the holes in the ground, that's all in camera. That's real. Those are huge water cannons buried in the ground. VFX could take that and augment them. When you have a real practical effect in camera followed by a big visual effect, it often helps the visual effects sit in a real space.
The creation of Mordor, I think, was early writer's room. What if you could do it in a way that was actually geologically possible? The idea of corruption of nature is a very Tolkienian idea that we want to explore.
We did a lot of research on the internet about volcanic eruptions, about ash clouds. And then with Alex, we looked at all these California wildfires to create that very specific look. I love the beginning of 7 with her waking up. I wanted us to be completely with her waking up, looking around and not understand where she was. So we mixed out all the sounds. Her ears are still ringing from everything that happened. You hear screams, but they're sort of from far away until she's progressively get back to life here.
We shot a lot of it at 33 frames per second, so slightly slow, because there's an eeriness to it as well. There's a disorientation. We shot all of that work on stage. We rebuilt parts of the village on stage so we could control the atmosphere. I hung a massive muslin rag around the set instead of blue screen or green screen. You know, when you fill it with fog and smoke, that muslin becomes a very soft, almost creamy, out of focus texture.
There was like no green screen. It just felt like we were in a post-apocalyptic kind of disaster zone.
While it does look terrifying, JD in particularly wanted it to have a bit of beauty, that it's almost beautiful in its terror, because what J.R.R. is doing is creating a place for his children to live, and so it shouldn't just be nasty. There is actually wants to have this character of grandeur to the idea of it. So it's horrible, but there's an underlying beauty in the horror.
Soon the sun will set. Do your part. And I swear to you, you shall see it rise again. Do you believe it? Do you believe it?
Everything is about setup and payoff. So the setup, what was exciting and what was really important is to set up the suspense in the beginning and the waiting, because that prepares the audience that something's going to happen. I think the most scary, the most horrible in war is the waiting for the battle. It's easy to just get drawn into it and just try to do some incredible shots. But if they don't tell a story, you're sort of lost. I decide from whose point of view am I telling the story. I did a few nights with only Ismail, and I shot him from his perspective and the battle. Then I went to Bronwyn. Everything was shot from her perspective. And same for Theo. It was about their point of views, their reactions to what was going on, and their story.
The scripts, they were pretty specific in terms of the character beats, but what wasn't specific was all the very specific action. That was more of a collaboration between Charlotte, myself, and our stunt team. The most complex one was at night with Arendir falling off the roof. And Charlotte came up with the idea of making it feel like it was all one shot. And that took weeks of practice, throwing people off a roof, figuring out where the camera could be to hide stitches, because ultimately it was a stunt performer falling off a roof. An orc wipes frame, and now it's our actor playing Arendir continuing on with the battle. No matter what, the story needs to be clear. And that means people have to see what's going on. Even if it's dark, there has to be some sort of point where they can see core of the story. And so part of that for us was using torches. So what I did was I had these huge amount of film lights that created a very underexposed base layer of moon. But ultimately, we allowed the torches to really light the scenes for us, which gives it a real look.
I write music that is most of the time very layered. But then when you're trying to tell action, it requires more propulsion, more ideas. On a technical level, there's more sound effects to compete with. The strings are doing something that itself is really cool. Then the brass are adding other ideas. The percussion are doing other ideas. And the orcs have their ethnic instruments. And then Numenor comes in. Themes are a big jumbled mess in the action soup of thematic ideas.
We work with the stunt department, for example, and into our slip-on limbs and arms, we designed the knees and the elbows to have thicker silicone, so therefore they didn't need to wear stunt elbow and knee pads, because when they're falling on the ground, under normal situations, they'd have to do that.
Something that was particularly wonderful for me was to work with all the horse wranglers. I think the horse work in this is just incredible. I always thought that those parts of like horse riding and stuff was CGI, and I couldn't believe that it was actually being done.
I was very inspired for the horse battles by the way the Ukrainian Cossacks were fighting, and how I could incorporate trick riding in this action to make it a bit different.